Hi, welcome to the first episode of the Plant Patrol. My name's Joel and this is an African violet. Together, we're going to spend the next couple of episodes talking about where this plant comes from, how it grows. We're going to talk about some of the plant anatomy. We're going to talk about some of its cool features. A lot of you guys already know a lot about this. This is one of the most popular plants in the houseplant trade. There's a lot of great content out there about how to grow it, and we will talk about that too. But the whole goal of this series is that we can dig deep into the history of the plant, where it evolved. We're going to talk about things like sky islands, and by the time we get through all of this information, we're going to be smarter growers. We're going to know what this plant actually wants and why it wants it. So I'm glad you're here, and I can't wait to talk with you. So let's start at the very beginning, in the Eastern Arc Mountains in Kenya and Tanzania. So these mountains are 13 different mountain blocks. We're most interested in the Usambara Mountains, which is where the African violets are endemic. When we say the word endemic, it means the location where these plants evolved. It's the only location on Earth where they come from. So they're endemic to the Usambara Mountains because that's where African violets were found, and that's the only place where they are. So we're most interested in the Usambara Mountains, but there's 13 total mountains here, and the biology and the geology is just really, really interesting in this space. We're interested in plants, but there's other people interested in animals. There's lots of cool stuff that happened here. So why is it so interesting to us? Well, it's an ancient landscape, of course. It's one of East Africa's oldest mountains. It's not the oldest, but it's a very old mountain. But being an old mountain doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a cool mountain or an interesting mountain or biologically significant. It just means it's old. So what made this mountain so interesting to us? So if we go back 30 million years, you would see these mountains are essentially a gigantic rainforest. So it's very hot, very wet. It's a rainforest. So you have mountains, you have valleys, you have all of the regions in between, and it's all a big rainforest. So from the perspective of animals and plants, it's all passable. You can basically have a plant up here, and through animals and seeds dispersal, it can go all over the place and can travel all around. Same thing as other animals, they can all kind of move throughout the rainforest. So for 30 million years ago, it was all one big rainforest. Then about 10 million years ago, we had some climate change. So it became cooler, it became a bit drier. And what that meant is the lowlands between these mountains became a savanna. So it almost became impassable. But the mountains themselves kept their forest, they kept their rainforests. The warm, moist air coming off of the Indian Ocean essentially became, a way for these mountains to continue to get, rain and heat and, continue their rainforests. So what we have then is tropical rainforests on the mountains, especially the Usambara Mountains, which we're interested in. And in between those mountains, it's a savanna. It's almost impassable, especially if you think of a little African violet. It's not going to make it from one mountain 100 miles to another mountain. It's going to be stuck there. And that's how it became endemic to those regions. So it's a really interesting thing of millions of years of that plant adapting and specializing in that environment. It became very different than the plant that was there 10 million years ago. It became a very specialist for that area, which is really interesting. And that happened for a lot of other things too. A lot of frogs and different plants and animals. All of those little we call them sky islands became really specialized. They're isolated and they evolved in their own pathways, which is really cool. So these sky islands are one of the reasons that these plants became so unique. The area was still warm. It had unique geology where they grew, and the moisture for the plants was perfect. So it kind of grew over time and became the area that we're going to study going forward. So the story begins in 1892 near Tanga. At the time it was German East Africa. Today we call it Tanzania. So it was started with a fellow named Baron Walter von St. Paul Hilaire. He was a German colonial district officer, so he wasn't at the time specifically looking for new plants, but he was walking along the coastal foothills near Tanga and the close by Usambara Mountains, and he noticed in some of the rock faces, the rock cliffs, these really pretty little plants. They had little flowers on them. They had fuzzy leaves. He called them the Usambara Veilchen, which is basically the little Usambara violets. So he called them violets. We already know today that they are not actually true violets. They just resembled violets to him. So they looked like what he grew up with and would have called a violet, but they're actually not true violets at all. So what he did was he collected some seeds. The notes are a little bit unclear whether he collected seeds or plantlets, but based on how difficult these plants are to grow today sometimes, it would probably be a pretty rough journey to go from East Africa all the way home with plantlets. So he probably sent some seeds to his dad. His dad's name is Baron Ulrich von St. Paul Hilaire, and he is the president of the German Dendrological Society. So he's a big plant nerd too, just like his son. So Dendrological Society is basically a group of people who study trees and shrubs, so all kinds of cool stuff there. So his dad basically grew them and handed them off to a fellow named Hermann Wendland, who was the director of the Royal Gardens in Herrenhausen in Hanover. So Wendland recognized it as something that was brand new to science and assigned it into the Gesneriid family. So he looked at it and said that this is, through the classifications that they do, he was able to figure out the family that it actually belongs in, and it's the Gesneriid family. It was published as St. Paulia ionatha in the journal Gartenflora, and it also showed up in a garden trade paper in 1893. So there was 1 year between when it was found in 1892 and when it was fully classified and published in 1893. So that's a nice, clean story, but there's two folks who would say not so fast. Their names are Sir John Kirk and Reverend W.E. Taylor. So both of these fellows actually found the same plant years before and sent it to the Royal Gardens at Kew. But unfortunately, their specimens were too far degraded by the time they arrived at the gardens to be formally described. So there's a whole process that has to happen where you get the samples, you press them, you describe them botanically, you have to write it up. It's a whole formal process, and the plants that they received were just too mushed up. Not a big surprise, like we said, they're hard to keep alive in our current environment, so imagine trying to ship them from Tanzania. They are actually, unfortunately, missed out on the naming rights for this particular plant. But the way that discovery of these things work is whoever gets the best specimen to the right herbarium at the right time kind of gets the naming rights. That's why we call it St. Pauli. But the words that I just used there, so an herbarium is an archive of pressed plants, dried pressed plants. And a lot of those dried pressed plants are actually what we call type specimens. So the type specimen is the single physical reference plant that a name is anchored to. So if you don't have that specimen plant, you don't have a name. And that's why Sir John Kirk and Reverend W.E. Taylor missed out on naming this guy. Our cool new African violet was actually exhibited as an Usambara Veilchen at the International Horticultural Exposition in Ghent, Belgium in April 1893. So that was the first time that it was shown. A seed house named Ernst Bennery Seed House began growing it that same exact year. And essentially it went from wild collection in 1892 to being produced on a semi-commercial level in 1893, which is a really quick time turnaround for even today for something like this. This is one of those rare cases where a global houseplant is traced to a single founder, single collector, and we know the year. So we know a lot of information about this. It's actually pretty interesting. Well, that's it for the first episode of the Plant Patrol. I hope everybody learned something. I know I did, doing the research to figure this stuff out. So there's a lot going on with this little plant here. Our next episode, we're going to talk about more detail about how to grow it. So we already kind of know where it came from. We know who found it. Now we're going to talk more about the anatomy of this plant and how to grow it in the next episode. I'm going to release these episodes every week. So this was the first one. Next week, we'll see the new one. So I appreciate everybody hanging out and talking and listening to this. If you don't mind giving me a like, give me a subscribe, and in the comments below, tell me what you liked and what you didn't like. Tell me your ideas, because it's a brand new channel and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much, and join me next week.